and how you became interested in this subject of rocketry.
Yeah, okay. My name's Wayne Cockcroft and I work for English Heritage. I'm an archaeological investigator, so it might seem quite strange that I'm interested in the history of rocketry. But one of the tasks I had about 10 or 15 years ago was to record the former raw gunpowder factory at Waltham Abbey, and amongst its 400 or 500 remaining structures was this small rocket testbed from the late 1940s. And at the beginning of the 1990s, we as an organisation, I think historians of technology in general, didn't really understand the development of rocket testbeds. A fair amount of research had been done on the history of rocketry, but the places where rockets were manufactured and tested was virtually unknown. So starting off from this one small rocket testbed at Waltham Abbey, I started research work to look at rocket test and manufacturing facilities in Britain, and this particular aspect of rocket history has links back to the German programs in 1930s and 1940s. When I began my work in the 1990s, these establishments had laid in former East Germany. Most also lay within former closed military ranges, so the sort of research we'd expect to do in terms of looking at secondary sources, unfortunately, was just not available to us. More recently, I've been extremely fortunate to be able to make a few trips to Germany and actually get into some of these research establishments. And what I've been fascinated are some of the design features coming through from the 1930s German sites to post-war British sites. I mean, I think we're all fairly familiar with the idea that German military technology was essentially brought over to Britain as war booty and exploited, but that we're also exploiting the research establishments and research facilities of infrastructure. I think that is something fairly new to historians of technology. I need to pause.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's good. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Do you want to keep that over there?
Yeah, is it out of shot? Yeah.
Yes, the problem is, you can tend to get a bit dry.
Well,
okay.
Speaking for an hour as well.
Well, yeah. Quite a long session this morning already. So, let's talk in a bit more detail about those sites and how they sort of interact, between the German sites and, the origins of the rocket sites over in this country. So, talking about Kunstdorf, first of all, which was the original German testing ground, and then the development of the other rocket sites. I mean, if you just...
Yeah. Yeah, one site I was extremely fortunate to visit in Germany a few years ago was at Kummersdorf, which lies just to the south of Berlin. It was originally an army artillery range from the late 19th century, and the rocket research establishment started off as quite a small facility led by Captain Walter Dornberg, as he was at that date, who gradually assembled a rocket research team around in the early 1930s. And what's remarkable within the former test range there, which had been used as a Soviet vehicle depot until about 1994, was many of these large test stands from the 30s still survive there. But in one sense, they're prehistoric because there's no surviving drawings of these sites. Most of the records were either destroyed or taken back to Russia at the end of the Second World War. So we, as historians of rocketry, had no knowledge of these sites. How were the Germans designing their rocket sites in the late 1920s and 30s? So it's only by going to these sites that we can begin to understand the sophistication of German rocket stand design in the 1920s and 30s. And one particular stand, Proof Stand 2, being constructed in 1931 to 32, was remarkably sophisticated, with bays to either side for the oxidant and fuel, and a rear monitoring and control room, and then also vents up the side where the efflux jets of gas from the rocket could be dispersed. And I mean, that sort of design I see in late 1940s rocket test beds in England. And I mean, we know there are a number of British teams going around Germany extracting objects, but also creating plans of these research facilities. I've not discovered the paper trail to this, you know, the account of the members of these units who are going to the rocket research establishments. They may still survive buried in an archive somewhere, or they may have been they may have been simply lost. So these physical objects, the actual test stands, are an extremely important historical document within their own right.
Is it possible actually the sort of similarities between the test facilities that they had in Germany and the test facilities over here weren't necessarily from a direct redrawing of documentation, but simply from the personnel who came over, working on their previous experience and recreating, you know, almost from memory.
Yeah, I think that probably is one route that, you know, there was the British teams going to investigate and extract this war booty, but then we know there was tens of German rocket scientists and engineers who came over to the United Kingdom. So I'm sure they will have liaised with their British colleagues when they're considering the design of these stands. And we know, for instance, Walter Radel, who went to work at Westcott, about 1950, he wrote an account of his time, first with Max Waller and at Kummersdorf and then at Peenemünde, and he drew sketches of the test stands that had been working on. So, you know, I think that's a very plausible suggestion of how this technology in terms of test stand design might have moved from Germany to the UK in the late 1940s.
Let's just talk about the actual sites in the UK and their origins and what they did specifically at different sites. I don't know which the most sensible one to start off is, really. Which was the earliest site in the UK?
There were a number of wartime sites. It's probably something we forget, that Britain did have a number of tentative guided weapons programmes during the Second World War. At Fort Halstead in Kent, for instance, there's a building from 1937 that was designed to aid the work on unrotated projectiles or rockets, the cordite rockets from the Second World War. That's probably the earliest surviving building in the United Kingdom associated with rockets. There was another test site for Lop Gap, an early guided weapons programme that survives in mid Wales at Ynys Las. At Walton on the Naze in Essex, there was a guided weapons programme run with COSOR and the government, although that's now being cleared and is being lost due to coastal erosion. So there are still remains of some of these wartime projects surviving. Unfortunately, the 1940s rocket test stand at Waltham Abbey no longer survives, but from Waltham Abbey, the main thrust of, if I use that phrase, of the rocketry work was moved across to Westcott, and there's a number of stands from the late 1940s still survive at Westcott. Again, a number associated with the German scientists who came over there, and really the test stands at Westcott most probably still date from the late 1940s and 50s, and were virtually used up to the 1990s for many British guided weapons and missile programmes.
How did these, I mean, probably makes sense to talk a bit more about the actual projects themselves and how the sites relate to the projects. Does it, I mean, what's the earliest one? Projects before Blue Streak, weren't there?
Yeah, I mean, Blue Streak would be the easiest one to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, because that, I mean, I suppose in a lot of ways, that did relate to virtually all of the sites.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was work carried out on all. Yeah, okay, well, that's what
yeah, we'll go with Blue Streak.
Yeah.
Yeah, the most complex British missile programme of the late 1950s was known as Blue Streak, and this was an extremely large missile designed to travel 1,500 miles, the so-called Moscow criterion, so it could threaten the heart of the Soviet Union from bases in the east of England. And once the operational requirement had been given for this for the weapon system designed, it really spread across very many government research establishments, the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment in terms of warhead design, but also into the private sector. The main contractor for the project was the de Havilland company based at Stevenage, who were responsible for the airframe, the actual rocket. And then Rolls-Royce at Anstey in the Midlands was responsible for the engine development, and Sperry Gyroscope for the guidance gyros. So very many private sector and government establishments were involved in the design of the missile. And at Spade Adam in Cumbria, virtually on the Scottish border, a former Forestry Commission area, about 3,000 hectares in extent, was taken over by Rolls-Royce. They were the main contractors on the site there, along with the de Havilland company, and they created a world-class rocket research centre in this area of wasteland, essentially, in the late 1950s, where the missiles were brought up from Stevenage. Got to remember, this is still pre-M1 and pre-M6. This massive missile being transported on low loaders to the north of England for test firings to prove the systems in England, but also to prove the rocket before it was taken for its full launch test firings in Woomera in Australia, where there were virtually identical firing facilities to the ones at Spade Adam for the full launch of the Blue Streak missile.
Just a thought. What was the extent of the infrastructure required on those planes? Did they manufacture propellants on sites there, or where were propellants manufactured?
Yeah, the Blue Streak rocket missile was a liquid-fueled rocket running on kerosene and liquid oxygen. Kerosene, petrol is essentially fairly easy to move around by tanker, but the liquid oxygen is a cryogenic oxidant, so it boils off at extremely low temperatures. So to ease the movement of liquid oxygen around, which was actually manufactured at very few places in the United Kingdom, a special propellant plant was established at Spade Adam, so they had their own liquid oxygen plant, which was also producing liquid nitrogen that was used for pressurising many of the systems within the rocket. It could also be used for test running the rocket. It's far safer to use liquid nitrogen rather than liquid oxygen within the research facility. So the establishment at Spade Adam had its own liquid oxygen plant.
And what about Westcott? Did they do the same? Although, yeah, I mean, they obviously did work on Blue Streak there, so did they have the same sort of facilities there?
I'm not actually sure. No, I'm not actually sure Westcott if they brought the liquid oxygen in from elsewhere. I mean, they were using far smaller amounts of liquid oxygen at Westcott, so
they weren't making the long burns that they were making. You know, the full.
No, they weren't doing
full
firings.
No,
and they might have been able to use liquid nitrogen in some of the test firings there, rather than liquid oxygen.
Yeah. When you say they use liquid nitrogen, did they use that just for sort of pressuring up systems to see if they worked under pressure, or how did they use liquid nitrogen?
I think they're using yes, they are using liquid nitrogen to pressurise the systems, to test essentially all the pipe joints are holding, and the various compressors and turbo pumps within the missile are holding up under that pressure.
And then there were facilities in Wales, and there was obviously the Isle of Wight site, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was a site which was developed at the Needles on the Isle of Wight to support the Blue Streak programme, and that was to test fire a rocket known as Black Knight, and its function was to launch the re-entry heads for the Blue Streak missile, both to test the different shapes for the re-entry heads as the re-entry head would come back through the Earth atmosphere, and also to test the various materials that they were considering for use in the re-entry heads as well. So a very important part of the warhead programme was supported by the Black Knight rocket. And then of course the Black Knight rocket then went on to develop into the Black Arrow rocket, which successfully launched the UK's first British-made satellite in 1971, actually just after the project had been cancelled.
That's cool, isn't it? And what's the Aberporth site again? Sorry, I couldn't.
The site of Aberporth in Mid Wales was developed on from the Second World War, and that was a guided weapons test site. And the advantage of the site at Aberporth was that it was coastal, so they could actually launch missiles across the Irish Sea, and also perhaps test the interception of aircraft and drones across the Irish Sea as well.
I suspect I know the answer to this, but presumably, what were the sort of local feelings of local people, or would you know about this? Feelings of local people to having rocket ranges set up within their areas. I mean, certainly Westcott. I mean that was an air base, Second World War, wasn't it? But presumably the people in the local area didn't actually know that there was rocket testing initially when they first started at those sites.
It's interesting in regards to the Spade Adam ranges. There's this absolutely massive range in the north of England. Speaking to people over the last few years, I think they were grateful for the employment these ranges brought. I mean, we must remember in 1959, the scientists would arrive in Carlisle by steam train and then be taken the 30 or 40 miles to this world-class space facility with this shiny stainless steel blue streak stood there. So, the contrast couldn't be more amazing. And they speak of the opportunities it brought. Rolls-Royce, for instance, on the site, they had an apprentice scheme on the site where local youngsters were trained up for the special skills they needed to work within the establishment. And even when the establishment closed at the beginning of the 1970s, a lot of the skills, the engineering skills that people had acquired on the ranges were then translated into small businesses within the Carlisle area. So certainly the people I've spoken to at Spade Adam, for instance, were extremely positive about the benefits this rocket range brought to them. And in terms of being hidden, it wasn't hidden at all. The engine test area, where there's four engine test stands, was visible from the local A road that connects Carlisle to Newcastle. So although it was a remote area, its activities wasn't necessarily hidden.
From a historian's point of view, I assume no effort was made really to preserve these sites, was it?
I think very much, in case of most defence sites, when they're closed, the drive is to get them closed by a certain date, and it's probably only recently, people have begun to consider recent sites of having historical importance. Certainly in the 1970s, there was no consideration at all given to the historical legacy of these sites. We're probably fairly fortunate. A lot of the employees were extremely proud of the work that they'd done at these sites. During the closure, took files and photographs and even artefacts. We know people with bits of Blue Streak rockets in their garage, but they'd spent their working lives. They were very proud of these objects, and they've disappeared. And it's only recently that these objects are starting to come to light again, and documents that allows us to build a fuller picture of these sites. And it's only, in the last 10 or 20 years, that we're considering preserving, a handful of these sites to tell these important stories of 1950s Britain and the great technological achievements of that decade.
It's such a shame, isn't it? Because I mean, it's such a short period of history as well, isn't it? Almost sort of, from the late 40s to 1971. It all happened within that, and so much of it's already lost, isn't it? It's just such a shame, really.
I mean, it was an extraordinary decade, the 1950s. I mean, the rocketry programme was just one of very many government-inspired research programmes, most actually directed to Cold War needs. We can think of the jet engine, the radar. There's also atomic energy. So great British research projects of the 1950s. A lot, as I say, were directed towards defence projects, but absolutely world-class science going on in Britain in the 1950s.
Yeah, half of them went over to the States, didn't they?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what else we need to cover, really. I suppose it depends a bit on how much detail we get into, really, doesn't it?